welcome once again to Caleb Likes Books. Today I have another book review for you, and that is for Beren and Luthien by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is one of the various different standalone books that have been released collecting Tolkien's writings, at least in this case, and I assume in the cases of others like The Fall of Gondolin and some of the other ones that I can't remember the names of off the top of my head. Mostly incomplete writings, but still kind of standalone stories that collect those writings, and then you also have editing by J.R.R. Tolkien's son, Christopher Tolkien, where he writes a bit about, his father's process and the way that things kind of came together. And this is kind of a romance story told in Tolkien's world. And this was one that I was really looking forward to because I love Tolkien. Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit are some of my favorite fantasy books. I also really like The Silmarillion, even though it was a bit difficult for me to get through just because of the way it's written. I think that it is super awesome. And I love the world that Tolkien created. And so I was very excited to read this one. I do think I was a little disappointed by it, but I think that's mostly just because of the format of this book, which I didn't realize going in, that it was going to be kind of a bunch of different writings all just collected into one volume rather than one singular story. But I'll talk a little bit about that a little later. So as far as what this book is about, it is a romance book between the characters of Beren and Luthien, obviously. Beren is a human, or man, as humans are called in Middle-earth, who falls in love with Luthien, who is an elf. And, they fall in love and everything, and then Beren's dad is not quite into that idea. And so he sends Beren off on this quest to steal a Silmaril in order for him to be allowed to be with Luthien. And this leads to some interesting situations and things like that, and some pretty cool stuff that I enjoyed as far as the story is concerned for this. So as far as positives with this book, first thing that I'm going to mention that I want to get out of the way before I forget about it, this book includes illustrations by Alan Lee, which are wonderful. There's maybe a dozen or so of them in here, I would say. I'm just going to flip through real quick and try to find a couple of my favorites that I remember, but they're really nice. Like this one right here, this is maybe my favorite one in the entire book. I'm trying to get the glare of the lights to not show on that, but I love that illustration. There's several other ones as well, some really cool ones. This is another one in there. Beautiful illustrations by Alan Lee. Of course, Alan Lee is kind of the he's basically the Tolkien illustrator at this point. And his work in this book is really awesome. Even though I don't typically take that in consideration when it comes to reviewing a book, I still want to point it out because I love the illustrations in this book. So that's something that you can look forward to if you ever pick this up. As far as the book itself, I did enjoy the general storyline of Beren and Luthien. It's presented in a few different ways, which, even though, again, it's not something I expected, and it's something that kind of, I think, in some ways hurt my enjoyment of the book, because, it's not just one continuous story. That's the full length of this book. This is like 200 some pages, and I was kind of hoping that it would be that in its entirety. It was interesting to get that story told even in different formats, and I enjoyed the story itself a decent amount. And I like the different formats, again, that this is told in. That's told in a couple of prose versions. There's like a lengthier prose version. There's a shorter prose version. There's a couple of excerpts that are not the full story, but kind of excerpts of other parts of the story. There's some poem versions that were interesting. I'm not much of a poetry reader, but I did enjoy at least the first one of those. I thought the first one, which basically retold most of the story, I actually really enjoyed. The other ones I wasn't quite as into, but that first one that just kind of retold the story in a different format I thought was actually really cool. And helped me appreciate the actual story a little bit more, because when I read the first prose version, as well as the shorter prose version that comes directly after it, I was like, yeah, that was good, but, it didn't really stick out to me that much. But after I read the poem version, it kind of, the events of the story kind of settled a little more for me, and I was able to be like, okay, so this is what this is really going on. And I enjoyed the story. I enjoyed, Tolkien's writing in this book. Tolkien is one of my favorite writers strictly in terms of his prose style. He's also one of my favorite writers in general. But in terms of his actual style of prose, how much I enjoy reading the stuff that he writes, regardless of the story, regardless of the characters, any of that stuff, he is arguably my favorite writer in terms of prose. Certainly top three at least. And I just enjoyed reading this book just on the level of enjoying the writing itself. I just think that his writing is beautiful and amazing, and I love reading it. So this also has that going for it, and that made going through, the various different versions of this story, even though it was a little frustrating at times to keep getting things retold or told in different ways or whatever, it was still enjoyable to read because I enjoy his style. As far as negatives with this book, because I don't have a whole lot to say about this book, to be quite honest with you, I do think that the multiple different versions of the story just hurt my experience just because that's not what I expected. And of course, I try not to judge books too much based on my expectations going in, but I would have preferred to have, just a long novel form of this story. Granted, this is what Tolkien had, and it's even incomplete as it is, so no long version of this story actually exists or ever existed. So I feel like that's not really a fair thing to say, but that's just what I would have personally preferred. I also, again, didn't find some of the, prose sections, especially kind of after the first half of the book. The first half of the book was largely telling the actual story, like, in most of its entirety. The rest of the book I was not as much interested in. Just kind of different, things here and there, retelling certain things, stuff like that, was not quite as interesting to me. But that pretty much wraps up almost everything I have to say about this book, really. I do think it was interesting going back to positives, because I forgot about this. I do think it was interesting to get a little bit of a look into Tolkien's creative process, because, as I said, this was edited by Christopher, who discussed a little bit of the behind-the-scenes kind of Tolkien's writing, and I actually did enjoy seeing that quite a bit, even though I sometimes kind of skimmed it a little because it wasn't really what I was here for. What I did read of it, I actually did think was interesting, and I liked, even though I didn't love reading the different versions of the story, it was interesting to see that he was kind of playing with this story for a very long time and kind of adjusting things here and there, trying to find ways to make it work better, things like that. And I thought that was kind of interesting. But that pretty much wraps up my thoughts on this book. Again, I don't have a lot of thoughts on this book. I enjoyed the story as it was presented here, which really was more of like a long short story or a short novella. It was only like 70 pages for the bulk of the, actual story that the book starts with. But I did enjoy that. I enjoyed the poem retelling of it. Some of the other stuff was cool. But overall, this one didn't do a whole lot for me, but it was interesting to read. And again, I enjoyed reading it because I just like Tolkien's writing in general. So as far as a rating out of 10 that I would give this book, I'd give it like a 6.5 out of 10. I could maybe be persuaded to give it a 7 if I'm mainly just considering the earlier portions. But, my experience with it overall was just like, it was good. There were parts that I liked, but other parts that I just wasn't really that interested in. I do think this is a worthwhile read for Tolkien fans. If you've read The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, all that stuff, and even if you've read The Silmarillion, you'll have a little bit of an introduction to the story here, because this actually is included partially in The Silmarillion. I think this is worth reading, and I'm sure the other different standalone books are worth reading as well. I would like to read the other ones in addition to this. So I would recommend checking this out if you are a Tolkien fan, for sure. Just go in knowing it's not, a traditional narrative. It's multiple different things. Even though it is interesting to see those, that might not be super engaging to you if you're looking for one continuous narrative like The Hobbit or like The Lord of the Rings, or things like that. But yeah. Overall, this was pretty decent. Didn't love it, but it was good, and I enjoyed certain parts of it a decent amount. So I guess there's that. So let me know in the comments if you have read Beren and Luthien, if you've read the other Tolkien standalones, like I said, Fall of Gondolin, or that's the only one that I can remember the name of, apparently, Children of Húrin, that's another one. Different things like that. Let me know if you enjoyed those as well, and if they're worth reading. I intend to read those at some point. This is just the one that I wanted to get first. So let me know if those are also worth reading, if you've read them, and what your thoughts on this one were. So that's pretty much it for this video. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you all next time.